I'm Andre Krauss, and I have a doctorate from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden in art history and a doctorate in media psychology from the University of Bucharest in Romania. And in combination, these two specializations have led me to study a lot of imagery, visual communication, and how they are perceived by the public. This year, because it's the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the death camps, the end of the Second World War, I thought that it would be very interesting to study the subject of the Holocaust, not only from the historical perspective, as it's often being discussed, but also almost with an art historical approach, because I'm going to review a lot of the imagery that throughout the history has reinforced the hatred towards the Jews and the scapegoating of the Jews, especially from the First Crusade in the Middle Ages and on to modern history. Some scholars say that actually, for example, Martin Luther's book, The Jews and Their Lies, had paved the way to the Holocaust. So the Holocaust actually practiced what many popes and rulers in medieval Europe have done on a smaller scale before. I think this is very interesting to discuss, and that's part of what my lecture is going to be about. The other topics that I would like to speak about during the lecture is issues that have come up, especially after the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1962, where Jews have been accused of going too easy to the slaughter, of not having put up enough armed resistance. Partly that they did not defend themselves as vigorously as they would, and partly they even blame the Jewish councils at the time that they didn't tell the community what's awaiting them, the disaster that is awaiting them in the camps, and therefore not enough people had made the choice perhaps to run to the hills and join the partisans. These are issues that are constantly discussed. There is an enormous literature on the Holocaust and an enormous literature on the sources of anti-Semitism which brought the Holocaust about. And yet, the questions are still unanswered. The questions are still debated. How could it happen? How could civilized Europe allow this to happen in their midst? How did they turn their back on their Jewish friends and neighbors in their hour of need? I hope we can discuss these issues and perhaps throw some light at least on the possible answers. As I say, even the scholarly debate is not yet decisive on how it happened and what could have been done differently. The three films that we have chosen for this series are Faithless, Genocide, and Defiance. We have carefully thought even about the chronology of the films, and the reason we're presenting them in this order is because Faithless, which tells the story of a Nobel Prize writer Imre Kertész, could illustrate the fact that the Holocaust came to the Jewry of Hungary, especially of Budapest, literally out of the blue, and literally at the time when the Germans were already losing the war in 1944. And yet, very diligently, the Nazi officials, with Adolf Eichmann leading them, have arranged the transport and ultimate destruction of almost the entire Jewish population of Hungary, 400,000 people. Imre Kertész was a child, a teenager at the time, experienced this horror, having been picked up from the streets of Budapest and taken to two concentration camps. We, in this film, then see basically the shock that the Jewish population had been put through, having first of all been isolated in the ghetto and then taken and transported to the death camps. The second film is a documentary, actually an Academy Awarded documentary from 1982, Genocide, narrated by Orson Welles and Elizabeth Taylor, with very, very important documentary archive films that are put together that show the thriving Jewish communities, especially in Poland, before the Holocaust, and the destruction that was visited on them. The imagery, of course, is very upsetting, but it's very important that we should acquaint ourselves with this history, especially in the view of what is happening these days with refugees that are sometimes not helped as they should be on the borders of perhaps many of the states that are described from 70 years ago. The last film is Defiance, which is a story of redemption, the story of the Bielski brothers who have run away from the German-occupied villages of where they lived in Belarus and took refuge in the woods and the marshes where the Germans couldn't pursue them. These three brothers, the Bielski brothers, that are described also in this film, have taken upon themselves not only to fight as partisans against German garrisons where they had the opportunity, or sabotage railways, or the usual partisan armed activity, but they have also saved a lot of Jews, a lot of refugees. They took them with them in the woods. And actually, survivors who tell the story, they speak of that place as Jerusalem in the woods. In other words, the place of refuge, the place of sanctuary. The Bielski brothers were the only ones who accepted even children and older people, which usually would be a drain on the partisans who didn't have the logistical support to keep people fed and clothed and sheltered under these conditions. And in this case, I have, of course, a personal connection to this story because my cousin, Abraham Rosenzweig, was, as a child of 7, he was saved by the Bielski brothers. His 2 brothers and parents were slaughtered by the Nazis as they were running away, and a neighbor took Abraham in his cart and they reached the woods, and he was literally saved by these people. The reason I'm mentioning a personal connection is because Holocaust denial is so widespread among people who still perpetuate anti-Semitic feelings towards the Jews. One of their ways is to deny the Holocaust. And I think it is now up to people of my generation, since the survivors themselves are getting old and fading away, perhaps it is our duty now to bear witness and make sure that people know that these things have indeed happened. They're not just stories.